All right, hello everybody. It's nice to meet you, sort of. I'm sorry that we have to meet under these circumstances. These are quite extraordinary times, but at least the learning can continue. So I'm sorry I can't meet you in person. I'm looking forward to doing that hopefully in a couple weeks. But I am Professor Lian Yu, and I will be your professor for this course, which is, it's basically an introductory course to Korean and East Asian history. I know that you are all international students, and some of you might even be visiting Korea for the first time. But regardless, I assume that you probably have not had much exposure to Korean history back in your home country. So this is my honor and privilege to be able to introduce you to Korean history. Now, the way that this course is set up is that we will normally, what we would do is we would have class for 3 hours once a week. So the first hour to hour and 50 minutes would be lecture, and then we would take a break, and then the remaining class time would be devoted to discussion. So in that case, you would break up into small discussion groups, and discussion leaders are assigned every week. So there's one discussion leader for each group, and some sample discussion questions will be posted, and then you'll have an opportunity about 45 to 50 minutes to discuss these questions within your group, and then we'll come together as a class to wrap things up and just to make sure that we are all on the same page. In general, let me explain to you a little bit about the content of this course. So while we are studying Korean history and culture in this class, and this is a broad overview, so we're looking at Korean culture and history from the ancient period all the way up to the modern period. We are focusing on Korea, but we are also going to compare Korea with whatever is happening in China, Japan, and whatever's in the northeastern region just above Korea, the Korean peninsula. So it could be the Jurchens or the Mongols or the Manchus or whoever it is that is up there at that time. And the reason why I have structured the course this way is because nothing ever happens in a vacuum. So what happens on the Korean peninsula affects the other regions and vice versa. It's the same with today. Even if we look at North Korea, which is ostensibly one of the most isolated countries in the world, they are still affected by what goes on outside, particularly in China, South Korea, Japan, and the United States. And what they do also affects the region as well. So we have to look at the region in its entirety to really get a good understanding of what is happening in Korea. So the focus is on Korea, but we will also look at the comparative side so that this will supplement your understanding. Now, this means that there's quite a bit of material and quite a bit of reading that is involved. I do not expect you to do all of the reading. I do not expect you to memorize everything in the reading, because that would just be impossible and unreasonable. What I do expect you to do is to go through the readings, and the readings are there to give you additional background information that may or may not have been covered in the lectures. And if there's certain names or dynasties or events that you are unfamiliar with, then you can look that up in the readings and read up about it. If it's not in the readings, then you can supplement your research with whatever online tools that you want to use. So I expect you to take the initiative. It's difficult because there might be some of you who have some background in Korean or East Asian history, like maybe some of you have studied Chinese history or Japanese history, and some of you may have not. So I have to try to accommodate students of all different levels, and so this is why I make the information available to you. But the PowerPoint presentations, those are really your study guidelines. So whatever is on the PowerPoint and in the lecture, that is mostly what we are going to focus on. And you'll see as we go through this course that there are several themes that we will be really looking at in closer detail. So it's the themes that I want you to try to see, and the bigger picture. I don't want you to get lost in the minutia and the details, although they are important. I'm not going to ask you some kind of obscure question on the exams like what was the taxation system of the Han Dynasty. So that's not something that we will cover in the lectures. It's not something that is really relevant to what we are going to be studying. So I won't ask you a question like that on the exams. You can read about it in the readings if that's something that interests you. But otherwise, you can just sort of briefly skim through that section, and it'll give you background information and a better idea of what was happening during the Han Dynasty, and it'll give you a point of comparison compared when we look at Korea and maybe Japan. But I do not expect you to memorize those kinds of things. The the key issues are, again, they will all be in the PowerPoint. So the main things that you'll have to focus on are lectures, what we cover in the lectures, big picture, and then the discussion questions. The discussion questions really kind of help you to take a step back and look at the region in its entirety and to think of, the bigger historical issues that are involved. Now, a second objective of this course is while we are learning Korean and East Asian history in its East Asian context, I am more interested in how you process all of this information that we cover. So what I mean by that is, in history, although there are a lot of facts, names, people, places, events, I am more interested in this class, and especially at this stage of your academic career, in seeing how you take in all of this information, and then given what we cover, taking a particular historical issue and establishing your own perspective or your own analysis or interpretation of that historical issue. And what you will see through the course of this class is that there are many different ways of interpreting what happened in history. There is not necessarily a right or wrong interpretation or analysis. There are right and wrong dates, there are right and wrong names, but oftentimes there is not a right or wrong interpretation of something that happened. So you can interpret something as being overall positive for the country or overall negative for the country, but I want to see how you interpret it and why. So if you take the position that something happened was overall positive, then pointing to specific historical examples to support your position, that is what I would like to see you do through the course of this class, and to try to articulate a convincing and persuasive position, opinion, analysis, or interpretation of your own. So this is what we will be doing in this class. We'll do that in lecture, we'll do that in discussion, and we'll do that through the midterm and the final exams. Particularly the discussion and the exams, that is your opportunity to articulate your ideas either in the verbal or the written form. So the reason why I teach this class in this manner is because not only do I think that Korean history is very interesting and an important subject to learn, but these are skills that you will be able to apply to any field that you decide to focus on or to go into. So, you know, whether you decide to go into finance or law or medicine or public relations or whatever it is that you decide to go into, it is the most influential people are those that have a convincing or persuasive opinion that is able to garner the most support from others. So this is a skill that will really be most beneficial to you, and learning Korean history is simply the vehicle through which you will be developing this skill. All right, so that's a bit about the class. Of course, if you have any questions about the class or the way that it's structured or homework, please email me and I'd be happy to respond. That will be, I'll try to be as clear as possible in terms of instructions, but obviously we won't be able to have our discussions in the manner that I usually conduct them. So for the next 2 weeks, or at least until we are finished with the online portion of the course, I will upload the discussion questions, and then I will ask you to write down your answers and then just email them to me. So we'll proceed with that for the first 2 weeks of class. All right, so for today, we are starting with the ancient period, and I should mention that if you have taken a look at the syllabus, the way that the content of this course is structured is that first we will look at the political history from the ancient to the modern period. And the reason why we do this is because it's really important that you know what political or state entities we are talking about as we go through the lectures. So, you know, if you don't know what the ancient three kingdoms in Korea were, or if you don't know what the Han Dynasty was, or you know, the Zhou Dynasty, you're going to hear a lot of new names and a lot of things that are very unfamiliar to you. So the first third of the course, we're going to focus on just the political history. So looking at the governments, the way that the state and the governments are structured, how the leadership is chosen and who these leaders were, and then interstate relations, so how these political entities then interacted with each other in the region. Once we get a solid foundation of that, then we are going to build on top of that in the next section of the course, which will focus on social and economic history. Because once we understand what these political entities were and how they operated and how they were structured, it will make a lot more sense to you as to why the society was structured the way it was, or why the economy functioned in the way that it did. And then in the last part of the course, we're going to look at the really larger topics like religion, philosophy, intellectual trends, cultural trends. So this includes things like Buddhism and Confucianism, and these large topics of religion or ideology. will make much, much more sense to you after we have studied the political, social, and economic histories of these particular regions. Because once you understand how the government was structured, how the society and the economies functioned, it will make much more sense to you as to why Buddhism was implemented, when it was and the way that it was, or why Confucianism was adopted as the ideology at the certain time in history. So these are like building blocks upon each other, which we will work on. And also the fact that we are going to continue to go back and revisit these entities, but by looking at them from these different perspectives, by this use of repetition will also help you to remember better what all of these entities were. At the beginning, it's going to seem like a lot of new information, and that's totally normal. It's fine. So I don't want you to freak out and get overwhelmed. So for today's lecture, we're going to look at the very ancient period and the beginnings of what we consider to be ancient history. So when we think of the world, this is pretty much how we see the world today, with very well-defined borders and ideas of what each country is, and the culture and the languages and the governments that are associated with each of these countries. When we look at the ancient period, we have to throw away all of our modern notions of how we see the world, and I'm going to ask you to try to see the world in this way. Because in the ancient period, there were no borders, and there were no boundaries, and there were no well-defined countries or cultures, especially in the sense that we understand it today, and we understand the world today. We have to try to reorient our thinking and to look at the world in this sense, because the ancient period is a period where really very little is defined. So not only have the borders not been set, but there's constant fluctuation. So you have these small entities, because we don't have these large countries or large empires that have been established yet, but there are these smaller entities throughout the region, and they come into conflict with each other, and so the borders are shifting and populations shift as well. Because let's say we have two groups, like two tribes, that come into conflict with each other. Some portion of if one tribe takes over the other tribe, then you'll have a certain number of the tribe that has been taken over that will escape, and they will go to another region. You have some that will be absorbed into the conquering tribe. And so we have, the expansion and contraction of not only entities, political entities, but also of territories and of populations. So this is constantly in flux. And all of these different tribes are speaking different languages. They have their own local customs, and nothing has been standardized or unified. So this is how I would like you to try to reorient your thinking when we talk about the ancient period. Now, when we look at the first, or the most ancient dynasty in China, This is the Shang dynasty, and we'll start off with this dynasty because this is the earliest dynasty that is supported by archaeological evidence. Now, this doesn't mean that there were no people who were living in this area before. There were, but we just don't have historical records that we can refer back to in order to talk about these early peoples. So we're going to start off with the Shang dynasty, and the other thing that I would like you to also try to keep in mind is, when we're thinking of the world in this way, this also means that there is no China and there is no Korea or Japan, at least not in the way that we understand it to be. Today we understand Japan, for example. Japan, it covers a certain territory and they speak a certain language and they have certain type of government and culture. But none of this has been defined in the ancient period. And as I said, we have people who are speaking different languages and practicing different customs, and everything is very localized. And so there is no Japan or Korea or China at this point. This comes later. So when we talk about this early period, I will be referring to the names of the dynasties or the empires or the kingdoms, but this is not like the Shang dynasty. This is not China in the modern sense yet. Because as you can see here, modern China takes up a much, much larger portion of territory than the Shang dynasty. But this is just one ancient entity that we will look at. So the Shang dynasty, you can see from the dates, this was a very old dynasty because we're talking about BC. And then following this, we have the Zhou dynasty, which took over the Shang dynasty. You can read about the Zhou dynasty in your readings, but the Zhou dynasty lasted for approximately 8 centuries, and so this is really quite an impressive accomplishment for this time, because once you take over and conquer a territory, what do you need to conquer a territory? You need military strength. So it's one thing to conquer a territory, but it's quite another to be able to maintain control over that territory, especially when you have conquered a large territory that encompasses a multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural peoples. And so to be able to maintain control over such a diverse population is very difficult, even by today's standards. But the fact that they did this is really quite impressive. So we have the Zhou dynasty, which was multi everything, and had incorporated all of these other previously independent entities into one. Now, there are some foundation myths. The foundation myth for the Zhou dynasty was that the first ancestor of Zhou was born to a mother, and the woman had stepped into the footprint of a god, and once she stepped into the footprint, she became pregnant. And because she became pregnant and she had this child, and she probably didn't understand why she became pregnant, she abandoned the child, but there are all these supernatural phenomena that protected the child, and this child eventually became the first ancestor of the Zhou dynasty. Now, there are many foundation myths in every culture and in every society. So if you come from a Judeo-Christian background, then the foundation myth is that we come from Adam and Eve, and we are all descendants of Adam and Eve who grew up in, who are from the Garden of Eden. In Japan, they believe that their ancestry comes from the sun goddess. And so all of the line of emperors, Japanese emperors, are descendants of the sun goddess. There's some African foundation myths, and in those foundation myths, the world actually began underground. So you see them underground, and then slowly people began to make their way above ground, and then that's how society began. So we have all of these different foundation myths. And why do we have these foundation myths? Well, people want to know, where do we come from? And want to know, the link between the past and the present and the knowledge of our ancestors. Now, I say that these are foundation myths because we don't have any kind of historical evidence to prove that these myths are true. So, but these have been passed down over the centuries as history. Are they history? Maybe stories, but regardless, these are the different things different stories that we have come to learn and to accept as our foundation myths. So let's look at Korea, the case of Korea. The foundation myths for Korea, there are actually a couple of them. You may have heard of this particular one, Dangun. He's considered to be a founding ancestor of Korea. He's this mythological figure who supposedly founded Old Joseon in 2333 BC. So I am going to show you the short video. All right, so that gives you an idea of who Dangun was. So the significance of Dangun is that because he has this divine origin where he is half God and half bear transformed into woman, and then he establishes this ancient state of old Joseon or Go Joseon. This supposedly means then that his origins are purely Korean, right? So he has these indigenous origins, and that's what makes him so authentically Korean. And this is something that became very important in the early modern period when we have Korea as a nation that is beginning to define itself as a separate entity from Qing China or from the Chinese Empire, and trying to establish itself as an independent nation. And in order to do this, they start looking for authentically pure Korean origins through Dangun. But this does not become important until much later in history. If we look at this other founding figure, this is a founding figure called Kija. And Kija supposedly existed around the time of 1000 BC. And there is textual evidence of Kija. He's mentioned in Chinese texts around the 2nd century BC. And he's described as a relative of the last king of the Shang dynasty. So remember this dynasty that we talked about, the very first dynasty in ancient China. So we have the Shang dynasty, and then it starts to decline. And as it declines and falls apart, the last king of the Shang dynasty had certain relatives, and because this dynasty had started to fall apart, and there was a lot of conflict and warring amongst themselves, a certain individual, this person named Kija, left the Shang dynasty and went to Joseon, which was now what we understand to be Korea. And he went to Joseon because he had felt that the virtue of the Shang dynasty rulers had disappeared, and he then set up his own entity in Joseon. Now, it's not clear whether or not he went there and because he had brought with him education and sophisticated learning that he was then accepted as a ruler in Joseon, or it could be that he was sort of dispatched there and then set up his rule, and the first king of the next dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, then enfeoffed Kija as the king of Joseon. It's not really clear how he came into power, but he is nonetheless considered to be another founding figure. And he played an important role when Korean dynasties had identified themselves with civilization from the Chinese mainland, like Confucianism. And so because China was considered to have this advanced civilization, then that meant that if Korea too had these ties with ancient China, then that meant that they were civilized as well. So we have these two different foundation founding myths and founding figures, and they one will take precedence over another depending on the geopolitical context of the time. Okay, and then just north of the area of the Korean Peninsula, so northern Korea and then southern Manchuria, there is also another state. This was called Puyo, and this state, it arose in this area right here, and it's a state where in early Korean records, so for example, writings from the Three Kingdoms, which we will talk about in just a moment, they tie their founding myths to Puyo. So rather than talking about Old Joseon, they talk about Puyo. Okay, so we have these different entities. We have right here Old Joseon, and then we have where's my cursor? We have Old Joseon here, and then we have Puyo up here. And so as you can see, there are these different tribes and these different entities in the region. And this is why I say that we can't really talk about a Korea at this point, because there is no unified Korea. There's just all of these disparate entities. So we have these two here, and as we get later in history, there is a shift from looking at Puyo as its founding origins to Gojoseon as the founding origins. Okay, so if we look at Old Joseon, it occupied approximately this area right here. So again, in the northern part of the peninsula and parts of southern Manchuria. And the titles of its early leaders were Dangun왕검. So again, Dangun, which was that founding figure we see in the titles of the leaders. So these are the very first ancient states that we see on the Korean Peninsula. If we look back at the Chinese mainland, so after the fall of the Zhou dynasty, we see that the Zhou dynasty then just disintegrates into all of these small separate little states, and then it descends into what is called the Warring States period. So as historians, when we look at this and we see this happening, what this tells us is that, yes, even though the Zhou dynasty lasted for a very long time, for 8 centuries, this meant that the fact that it disintegrated into all of these different states means that it was not truly unified to the point where the people in the Zhou dynasty considered themselves as Zhou people. They actually still considered themselves to be either Qin people or Jin people or Chu people or Wu people. Their connection was to their locale, and this is another characteristic of the ancient period, is that your identity, your customs, your practices are tied to the local community, not to the larger entity, but to your local community. And so this is what we see happening during the Warring States period. And then we start to see again this reformulation. So the smaller states then, they start to coalesce together, and they start to form bigger entities, and it's eventually this outer entity right here, the Qin state, that is able to conquer the rest of these and to reunify China. So this is a historical pattern that we will see from the ancient period going forward, is the rise and fall of these dynasties. So you'll have a dynasty that will become very powerful and they'll be able to conquer the region. But again, because once you conquer a region, it's very difficult to maintain control. Eventually, they will disintegrate and fall apart. And so then after that disintegration, over a period of time, they will coalesce and then come together again. And then that dynasty will fall. So this rise and fall of the dynasties that we see, this is a historical pattern. The Qin dynasty, as I said, they were able to reunify. And again, we have a multi-linguistic, multicultural, multi-ethnic entity. And if you look at the dates of the Qin dynasty, you'll see that it was extremely short-lived. It only lasted for about 15 years. Which once again shows that you can conquer a territory, but it's very difficult to maintain control. So they conquered, but rebel leaders emerged. Again, it's because they have this more loyalty and more identity with their locale. And then we go back to the Korean Peninsula, and we have the emergence of yet another founding figure. This is Wiman Joseon. Now, from this political turmoil of the warring states, the story goes that we have this individual Wiman who flees from China and goes to Joseon. So because there's just too much chaos on the Chinese mainland, he goes to Joseon and he overthrows the reigning king of old Joseon and then takes over and establishes what is called the Wiman Joseon era. It is unclear as to whether or not he comes from Korean origins or Chinese origins. So whereas Dangun is considered to be pure Korean, Kija is considered to have come from China. It's unclear whether Wiman was from Korea, like from old Joseon, and then had spent some time on the Chinese mainland and then returned, or if he was originally from the Chinese mainland and then went over to Joseon. It's not true, or it's not clear. But the real fact of the matter is that it doesn't really matter whether or not he's Korean or Chinese, because these are modern sensibilities anyway. And these are issues that modern historians care about, whether or not Wiman was Korean or Chinese. But at this point in time during the ancient period, there is no Korea or China, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so these are the implications of what is happening, but the main point is that everything is in flux, right? So dynasties rise and fall, and when they rise and fall, you have great instability in the region and populations that are moving around and borders that are shifting. So everything is in flux, and that also includes things like culture and identity. The fact that we have these influential people that are moving from one location to another, like Kija or like Wiman, shows that there isn't a well-defined sense of, oh, I'm Chinese or I'm Korean. It's just, I'm going to set up shop here and this is where we're going to stay. All right, and then we go to the Han Empire. So after the Warring States period, we have the fall of the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty takes over. And the Han dynasty, as you can see from this map, was a much larger and more powerful entity on the Chinese mainland. And so because they were so powerful, they began to try to extend their influence into this region where old Joseon was, and Puyo. And once they start to do this, and they conquered Wiman Joseon, they set up 4 commanderies. So these are the 4 Han commanderies. one here, Xuantu, Lolong, Jiangfen, and Linton. So these 4 commanderies. And they tried to establish control in this region, but there was very powerful local opposition to the Han. So again, strong identity towards one locale, their own locale, and so there's a lot of pushback to these. So eventually, these 2 southern commanderies were abolished, and this one was moved farther west. And Lolong was the only one that was left, and it was eventually conquered by Goguryeo. So Goguryeo was this entity that began to emerge approximately in this area up here. And they began to consolidate their power and to expand in the north. So when I say that they were expanding their power, what this means is that we have, as I said, these very small entities that are spread across the territories. And usually what happened was you'd have a small walled town state. Okay, so this small state, which is like a town, they build a wall around themselves for protection. And then they begin to combine with other walled town states. Why do they do this? Because there's safety in numbers. And so if you make alliances, then you can protect yourselves better. And then you have these other walled town states that begin to combine with each other, and they start to form a single large confederation. And then this confederation might expand or become more powerful, and then they become a confederated kingdom. And so this is what happened with Goguryeo, is Goguryeo becomes a kingdom. And in the south here, we have these different entities, including the 3 Han, the Mahan, Pyeonhan, and the Jinhan. Back in China, again, China falls into disarray, so rise and fall of these dynasties, and we have these different entities that emerge. Goguryeo up here has a certain amount of interaction with whatever's in the northern part of the mainland, and Baekje has relations or connections with whatever's in the southern part. And so we begin to see the formation of the 3 kingdoms. Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Shilla in the southeast. There's also this other entity, Kaya, but Kaya didn't last very long. It was eventually absorbed by Shilla. So these are the 3 ancient kingdoms of Korea, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Shilla. And these borders that you see here were constantly shifting because these 3 entities were always in conflict with each other. So we see these borders constantly shifting. Goguryeo at some point expels Lolong. They expel Lolong in 313. They move their capital further south to Pyongyang. And because they are expanding southward, they start to exert pressure on Baekje and Shilla on these northern borders. At its height, this was what Goguryeo looked like, so they're obviously very powerful. But because they also were expanding to the west here, they came into conflict with whatever tribes were in that area, as well as over time with the consolidated states in the northern Chinese mainland. So really what you have is Goguryeo, because they are at conflict on all of their borders, this border here to the north and to the south, they have to become this mighty warrior militaristic kingdom. Baekje, which occupies this area down in the southwest, they start to push their borders northward. So they come into conflict with Goguryeo when that happens. They don't come into as much of conflict with Shilla because there's this mountain range here that divides Baekje and Shilla, and so it's like a natural barrier. But Baekje had very active contact with the southern part of the southern mainland in China and also with Japan. And so because of this interaction, they ended up having a very sophisticated culture. Shilla, which occupied the southeastern portion of the peninsula with their capital at Gyeongju, was relatively isolated. And so they were the least developed culturally. And at their height, they were able to occupy this territory, but this was rather short-lived during the Three Kingdoms period. And then we have Kaya, which is kind of sandwiched in between Shilla and Baekje, and it had emerged out of a confederation of 6 city-states, but eventually becomes absorbed by the Shilla dynasty. And then if we look at what is happening in Japan, so Yamato Japan, which we in general, historians will look at Yamato from approximately the reign of Empress Suiko. She reigned from 592 to 628, and historians will look at that period. So again, this is CE, not BC, but 6th century CE, and we look at this period because this is about the time that the historical records for Japan or Yamato Japan become more reliable. Before that, the record keeping was not reliable, or it was just written so long after its foundation that you can't say that it's an actual history. All right, so before we go to the early relations between these states, I'm going to show you a short video of Goguryeo. All right, so this is just to give you kind of a visual from this time period so that you have an idea of what it possibly looked like at this time. There are a few things that I'd like to point out to you is that, you know, this is essentially a battle scene, right? So we have, again, this constant conflict. And why do we have this constant conflict? Well, it's because all of these entities are trying to expand their borders and expand their territory. One of the questions that I'd like you to think about is, why do these entities want to expand? What is the purpose of expanding? But when we look at this kind of intense conflict and, you know, the killing and fighting with each other, this should really impress upon you that these different entities, Goryeo, Baekje, Shilla, and the surrounding areas, the 3 ancient kingdoms of Korea, they did not consider themselves to be Korean. And this is why I have to repeat myself several times when I say that, you know, we don't want to think about Korea, Japan, China in the sense that we think of it today, because Goguryeo people thought of themselves as Goguryeo people. Baekje people thought of themselves as Baekje people. Shilla people thought of themselves as Shilla people, and they thought of themselves as different from the others. In fact, Goguryeo, the language that they spoke up in Goguryeo, was different from the language that they spoke down in Shilla. The way that they dressed was different. Their eating habits were different. So, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So we have to understand that these people, if you're from Goguryeo, you thought of yourselves as a Goguryeo person. And even within Goguryeo, because this is such a large territory, we still see diversity. And we still see that attachment to one's local identity. All right, so looking at early foreign relations. If we look at the Sui and the Tang dynasties, so these two dynasties together, they overlap between 581 to 907. They end up conquering the largest territory to date on the Chinese mainland. And when you have such a large and powerful entity that is established in this area, how do you think this is going to make a state like Goguryeo feel? This makes them feel threatened, right? Because when you have a direct neighbor that is very powerful, they could possibly take over your own territory. So we see that Goguryeo, feels that they need to strengthen their defenses. But even though the Sui and the Tang dynasties were the largest and most powerful entities, this did not mean that Goguryeo or the other kingdoms, ancient kingdoms, they thought of the Sui and the Tang as superior to themselves. They recognized that China, or that the Sui and the Tang, were advanced and powerful, but the three kingdoms in Korea, they still used their own raid titles, and they did not recognize China as a suzerain power. This tributary system, which goes into effect and is implemented from about in full form in the 14th and 15th centuries, that's not the case then. At this point, this system is in the process of formation. Excuse me. The tributary system is this concept where the mainland here in China is ruled by the emperor, and he is the ruler. China, whether it's the Sui dynasty or the Tang dynasty, is the center of the world, or the center of civilization. The ruler of the Sui or the Tang is the emperor, and he rules everything under heaven. Anybody else in neighboring states, these are tributary states or vassals, and they are considered, their rulers are considered to be kings if the Chinese emperor recognizes them as kings. So eventually what we have much later, hundreds of years later, emerging out of this is within Korea becomes a tributary state, but up here in the north, they're considered to be northern barbarians. The Japanese are eastern barbarians, and obviously west of China, including later in the 18th century when the Europeans come, they are considered to be Western barbarians. But this system emerges out of necessity given the historical circumstances of the time, because we have so much conflict and instability and the fluctuation of borders and populations. In order to try to stabilize relations within the amongst the states and to stabilize the populations, we have a system of foreign relations that develops, and that eventually becomes the tributary system. Okay, so we have the Sui dynasty on the mainland of China, and Goguryeo, which is this very militaristic, powerful kingdom. Sui dynasty comes into conflict with both the Goguryeo and with the Turks. And because they are powerful and they are expanding. And at some point, Goguryeo forms a secret alliance with the Turks. And when the Sui dynasty finds out about it, how do you think they feel? They feel threatened, because if Goguryeo and the Turks ally with each other and they attack the Sui dynasty, they could potentially take over. So because of this, the Sui attack Goguryeo in 612. And when they attack, they are serious. They mean to take Goguryeo down. And we know this because when the Sui send over troops, they send over 1 million soldiers. Now, this is in the early 7th century. Do you know how many countries in 2020 have armies, a standing army of 1 million soldiers? There actually are not that many. We have China, the US, India, and I believe Russia is over 1 million now. The North Korea claims to have 1 million, but that's debatable. But these are, current figures. So if we think about 1 million soldiers in the 7th century, this is just kind of mind-blowing. So they were serious. They meant to take down Goguryeo, but Goguryeo, because of this particular general, Uljimundeok, he actually defeated the Sui, and the Sui were not able to take over. So the results are that we have the Goguryeo that are in conflict with the Sui, and then later, when the Tang dynasty takes over the Sui dynasty, the Tang dynasty also come into conflict. And so, because Goguryeo is in conflict there, we see that Goguryeo, they form an alliance with Baekje to their south. And they don't really like Shilla. Japan had also formed an alliance with Baekje. So Shilla felt like it was isolated. So Shilla went to Goguryeo and asked if Goguryeo would break its alliance with Baekje, and Goguryeo said no. So then Shilla went to Japan and asked the Japanese if they would break their alliance with Baekje, and the Japanese said no, we're good. So then Shilla went to the Tang dynasty and said, hey, let's form an alliance. And the Tang dynasty, because they had come into conflict with Goguryeo, they said, let's do it. So the Tang dynasty, they form an alliance with the Shilla. And this was a really strategic move, because the Tang dynasty was the most powerful entity in the region. So their capital was at Chang'an. If we look at the capital, Chang'an was a planned city, so all its streets ran north, south, and east and west. There were 1 million people living within the capital and 1 million people living just outside the capital. So this was probably the largest city at the time in the world. It was, again, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilinguistic, and this is partially because this is also the time of the height of the Silk Road trade. So you had peoples from all over the world that were coming and traveling to Chang'an, the capital, and engaging in all kinds of trade or scholarship or some kind of interaction. So after the Tang dynasty forms an alliance with Shilla, Goguryeo and Baekje invade Shilla in 655. And so the Tang sent some minor expeditions against Goguryeo, but they all failed. So Shilla says, we should change our tactic. Instead, let's invade Baekje. So in 660, Tang and Shilla forces invade Baekje, and Baekje falls. in 667, they start to attack Goguryeo. And it takes over a year to capture the capital, but in 668, Goguryeo finally falls. So we have then this, what we call unified Shilla. So because they had been able to conquer Baekje and Goguryeo, now we have Shilla that takes over the peninsula. But there's some struggle with the Tang dynasty because the original agreement was that Shilla would be able to take over the peninsula up to the river right about here. But the Tang dynasty says, no, actually, we're just going to make you the governor of the peninsula. And Shilla got very angry. So in the end, they end up taking over a reduced portion, so south of Pyongyang here. And we'll go over unified Shilla and its structure, its political structure in the following lecture. But this concludes our lecture for today. And please check for the discussion questions and instructions on what to do from here. So this is our first lecture. We'll have another lecture next week online, and then hopefully we'll be able to meet in person for the third lecture.